Hey, viewers and viewers, my name is General Red Strategist, and welcome back to Say Being Hunted episode 560, sorry, went a bit garbled just then. It's an evening on a Friday, as of when I record this. Work is done, of course, for the day. Well, it's actually been done for a couple of hours, at least, really, already, because it has just gone 8 o'clock, like I say, in the evening, that is. And, yeah, it's just time for me to have another relax, a little sit down, maybe, just have a little bit of a relaxing time recording some Sir and all that, because why the heck not? Right, there's a device piece over there. We're on the West Island, incidentally, of this here map, which is great stuff. I'm just going to pull these robots out over here. You have that there. Right, that'll pull them out, and I'll just loop around and then grab their device piece. As you do. Now, hope you guys are all doing well. I mean, I always kind of say this, don't I, in these Being Hunted episodes, but got to be sociable and all that. Now, something actually interesting that I do have on my mind at the moment is, of course, well, I say of course, not of course really, that makes it sound like it's something obvious, but, for something actually that I have been doing recently, which is of interest to me, to put it this way. I probably talked before about how, I am a little bit of like a bookworm, or whatever else have you. I do enjoy a good bit of reading and all that. And, shit, they're coming this way, aren't they? Fuck. Crap they are and all. Shoot. Okay, hold on. Have that over there. That'll draw them out a little bit. Those guys are just over there. God, that was a near miss. Sorry, what was I talking about? I was mentioning something interesting, or that I'd found interesting recently. So, I think I've talked before about how, I am a bit of a bookworm, I do like my literature, I do like my reading and all that. And I've also probably mentioned before how, I'm very much I am a history buff, but in particular I also love things like naval and maritime history, that kind of thing. Because, I think I've talked about sort of historical topics before in some of my Being Hunted episodes. And an interesting book, actually, that I've been reading at the moment, I've been reading it for the last few weeks because it's actually quite a thick, quite big book, is a book published in 2013 called Empire of the Deep by Ben Wilson. It's not a fiction book, it's a history book, but it's all about essentially British naval history, basically. And it starts off quite far back, in like the Dark Ages, with the old sort of Anglo-Saxon kings, when, for the ancient English people, when naval power was essentially a lot to do with just like coastal raiding and warfare and things like that. But then it goes right through to 2013, so it's this very broad, sweeping historical narrative. And it's quite a fascinating little book. It's really quite an interesting read. So at the moment, I've where I'm up to as of when I record this, I've just finished the chapter on the Battle of Trafalgar. Of course, 1805, the big shining example of British naval supremacy that had a very big impact on the sort of British popular imagination for decades, centuries to come. So you could say kind of the apex in many ways of British naval supremacy at that time. And but prior to getting to Trafalgar, of course, I read a lot about the Navy in Nelson's time, so like the Battle of the Nile, stuff like that, which is another great example of sort of late 18th, early 19th century British naval mastery. And like I say, it's just a fascinating read. And prior to all the stuff about the Nelsonian Navy, of course, it's been through obviously like the 18th century and then like the 17th century. So Britain's naval wars during the times of like Cromwell, for instance, and the Protectorate, which is a period of history that I don't know a lot about. Because I remember learning about the English Civil War, for example, in the 1640s back in school, but since then I've never really read anything or learned anything else about it. So it's a period of history that I don't know too well, and in particular what came after the English Civil Wars, namely Britain's only real experience of Republican government under Cromwell. That's a period of history that I just don't know too well, so it was kind of interesting to delve a bit into that. But it was interesting because when I was sort of reading about that kind of era and Britain's kind of naval realities at that time, what's always striking is how quite often British naval mastery at sea has often relied as much on illusion as it has on actual material power, to put it that way. So sometimes British naval mastery has been illusory rather than an actual thing, an actual fact of reality. So it's really interesting because it talks a lot about kind of Britain's naval failures as well as its naval successes, which makes for a really kind of rip-roaring historical narrative, like I say. But the one thing that's been really quite fascinating about it is just really kind of emphasising how utterly brutal historical naval combat, especially in the gunpowder and the sailing ship era, really was. Because the thing is, for a long while, I mean, we've always known that it's quite brutal. You know, if you've seen films like Master and Commander, great film, by the way, you should always watch it if you get the chance. I really enjoy that film. But if you ever watch films like Master and Commander, and you see how brutal it is, like the kid who loses his arm, who basically, you know, gets injured, has to have his arm amputated. You know, it's grim. And then, like, for example, in Master and Commander, the sort of final battle against the Acheron, the French privateer, where it is just an absolute clusterfuck. Because with all the, like the cannons going off and the smoke in the air, the low visibility and just the chaos that unfolds. Yeah, I mean, probably how it went in real life, that. But God, yeah. But like I say, the book that I'm reading just really does a good job of just painting how grim historical naval combat in the sort of sailing ship gunpowder era really would have been. And indeed, just particularly how utterly horrifyingly brutal it would have been as well. Because the thing is, like, you read in that book some of the accounts of the absolute mess that ships were in following their big sort of naval engagements. Because the thing is, like, in the gunpowder era, you know, the classic sort of battle tactic in naval engagements was the kind of the line of battle, where you try and get all your ships in like a big long line, and then you would just try and broadside each other. And so naval battles would often just become a big sort of slugging match, and it often came down to a combination of whoever had the biggest ships with the most guns, with the most well-trained crews that could lay down a fairly consistent wall of fire. And of course, as you can imagine, with, you know, gunpowder weapons, gunpowder cannons that just fire inert round shots, or if not that, things like canister round, grape shot, or chain shot that goes like whirring through the air. You can imagine how utterly bloody things got on board when you know, the melee started happening. And Ben Wilson's Empire of the Deep just does a really good sort of job of describing it. Because the thing is, like, there are accounts of sailors on these ships that have survived time, and they just talk about how utterly blood-soaked the decks of their ships became, just how there were like mangled bodies everywhere of people who'd just been absolutely shredded by cannon fire and things like this. And he said that in many ways the low visibility caused by smoke going up in the air from cannons laying down broadsides, and also the fact that obviously as those cannons go off, it's quite loud, so after an intense naval battle in that kind of era, it would not be uncommon for crews to be deaf for a day or two afterwards because their ears would just be still ringing after the absolute chaos and the absolute cacophony of noise. But apparently, like, that low visibility and that sort of deafening caused by the guns firing actually was the thing that probably prevented a lot of sailors from going mad under the stress, because it actually hid things like the sight of just their comrades in arms being absolutely shredded by cannon fire, and just drowned out the sounds of them screaming and things like that. It's really grim. Grim reading, but it gives you a real sense of how brutal it would be. And the thing is, like, you know, the line of battle, like I say, was kind of the classic tactic in the era of gunpowder artillery navies. But the thing is, you know, whilst they would try and line up and pummel each other, increasingly as, you know, you got through the 18th century into the early 19th, you know, certain British naval commanders like Nelson, for instance, and a couple of his predecessors, they would sometimes actually, rather than trying to run sort of parallel to an enemy line and just batter them, they might instead try to, like, punch through the line in a sort of, maybe not quite perpendicular approach, but, you know, they would sort of try and bisect through the line and things like this, so that instead of firing broadside to broadside, instead they will be firing their broadsides at like the bows or the stern of enemy ships where they're most likely defended. But also apparently another sort of tactical benefit of doing that was that if you could get off a good broadside into, say, like the bows or the stern of an enemy ship, the cannonballs that you fired would basically go ricocheting, potentially, right down the length of the enemy ship. And of course, you can imagine the absolute carnage that that would cause. Not just the physical damage to the ship, but potentially the sheer fucking mutilation it would do to the crew on the deck. Good lord. But yeah, just gives you an idea of how brutal it was. Like I say, great book. If you're into sort of English/British naval history and all that. So yeah, it's been fascinating to read. Especially, like I say, for tales of British naval failure. Because that's the thing, you know, certain battles in history do dominate, you know, traditionally they dominate sort of the British popular imagination. So like Trafalgar, because obviously, you know, it was a stunning victory for Britain. And, you know, I think I may have talked a bit about this in Survey Being Hunted before, about how certain historical events, things like that, how, you know, sometimes, depending on the country you're living in, there might be sort of like a bit of a fixation on that in popular narrative. So like here in the UK, for instance, I think I've talked about World War II as an example of that. But, you know, the Battle of Trafalgar is another one, because obviously it was Britain's moment of naval greatness. But of course, like I said, British naval mastery has never always been assured, and sometimes it was more illusory than real. And Ben Wilson's book is a good one for giving you really a much more fleshed out overview of British naval history. It's great and good stuff. But, you know, I'm wondering what book I'll read after I've finished Ben Wilson's Empire of the Deep. Not that I'm finishing it anytime soon. Like I said, I've only just read the chapter for the Battle of Trafalgar. So I've got the remainder of the 19th century, the entirety of the 20th century, and the first 13 years of the 21st century to get through yet. So I'm going to be there for a while with that book. But the thing is, I do have another book, not on a naval history, but on a sort of maritime history more generally, called Sea People. I think the author is Christina Thompson, and I believe it's all about the history of essentially Polynesian navigators, the sea peoples, basically of the Pacific, and about sort of like Pacific maritime exploration, that kind of thing. So I'm kind of looking forward to that one when I eventually get around to reading it as well. So less about naval warfare, I would imagine, and more about maritime exploration. I'll have to keep my eyes peeled though for any more sort of good naval and maritime history books next time I pop down to Waterstones or something. Because I'm sure there's plenty, you know. I mean, the thing is, whenever I go into Waterstones and I look on the sort of history sections for naval and maritime history, a lot of it tends to be things like, you know, World War One, World War Two sea battles, that kind of thing, which is, you know, fascinating. But like I say, there's just some periods of history that maybe it would be interesting for me to pick up a book and read a bit more about, ones that I haven't really read about all that much before, like, you know, like maybe the Cromwellian period of English history, for instance. I'm sure that one's quite an interesting one. I think that one kind of tends to put people off because sort of the run-up to the English Civil Wars and, of course, the war itself and then what came after is a very complex period. Like, the politics of it, I think, is what puts people off, because there's a lot of, like, turnover of ministers and politicians and parliaments and this kind of thing. And so I think people sort of get put off because it's a lot to basically take in mind. But, you know, stick at it and it'll be very interesting. But again, it makes me also sort of think about historical ships that I would love to visit sometime in my life. I've probably talked about this before. Have I talked about HMS Victory and HMS Warrior, the times I visited those? I will have done. I probably talked about the time I've, you know, been to Portsmouth here in the UK, where we've got a couple of good historical ships that you can actually go on board and visit. So yeah, Victory and Warrior, I've been on those ones. They're two great historical ships if you're ever in the UK, and more specifically if you're in the Portsmouth region. You know, HMS Victory, of course, being Nelson's flagship at the Battle of Trafalgar, and HMS Warrior being a ship that was commissioned in 1860 into the Royal Navy, and which basically was never actually used in combat because apparently it was so good of a deterrent, because it was so powerful, and it struck so much fear into Britain's enemies that they wouldn't dare challenge it. But, you know, you can go on those in Portsmouth and they're fascinating. It's interesting because, of course, HMS Warrior, you know, is only separated from HMS Victory by, what, about 60 years? But, of course, because HMS Warrior sits right in the middle of the Victorian period when technology was advancing, the sort of technological difference between the two ships is quite striking. You know, going from a sailing ship to a steam-powered warship and all that, which is great. But you know, there's tons of other ships I want to visit. Like maybe I should go down to Bristol at some point and go on the Cutty Sark. That'd be a great one, wouldn't it? You know, if ever I went over to the United States, I probably would definitely want to visit USS Constitution. That'd probably be a great one, that would. I'm trying to think of other ones. I know there's a like a 16th or 17th century warship in Sweden. Is it the Vasa something or other? Oh god, I can picture it in my head, but I keep forgetting the exact pronunciation of the name of it. I'm sure people can remind me. Well, we're going to wrap this episode up here, ladies and gentlemen, because I've been going for a while. So, hope you enjoyed that. I know it's probably just a short little episode there, just listening to me ramble on about a book I was reading, but, you know, maybe I should talk a bit more about the books I read and all that, because I've got tons of them actually on my bedside cabinet that I want to get through, so I'm sure there'll be some great ones. You know, maybe that's something I should do on Propagandist Book Reviews. Well, maybe. Who knows? I don't know. I've no idea. Alright, yes, let's wrap up here. Facebook to the links down below, along with the link to my Propagandist channel for anyone interested. And if you enjoyed, a like is of course always appreciated. But other than that, I'm signing off now. Goodbye, everybody. Learn to jump off to his doom, perhaps. Whoop! Never mind, you can't. Oh, wait. Ah, you bitch. Oh. I think. Yep, he just jumped to his death. Like an absolute idiot. There we go. That's how you do that one. At least we took the local route. Do you hide anything over here? So you did. Is that good? It's a Dobson. Hell yes. Thank you very much for that. That's much better. Get some health. But yeah, like I say, Luffy's tutorials, they're for beginners, very much. People who are completely new to mapping and GTK Radiant. But obviously, there's a lot of advanced techniques with RTCW map making, which Luffy's tutorials don't cover. So things like, for example, custom textures,